Hello class, welcome to week 7. We will be finishing up the last chapters before our midterm next week. We'll be covering selections from chapter 8 and chapter 9, both of which deal with evolution. Specifically, these are the sections that you are responsible for knowing from your textbook. Our learning objectives are to explain evolution in action. We should know something about Darwin's journey to an idea, how he came up with the theory of evolution. Be able to describe the 4 mechanisms that give rise to evolution, how populations adapt through natural selection, and be able to explain the evidence for the occurrence of evolution. Here's an example of an animal that's well adapted to its environment. Almost every animal is adapted in some manner. But here we see the glass-winged butterfly from Peru. So think about what are some advantages in the environment that this butterfly may live in. One is it's transparent, so it's probably hard to even see. But another thing is there's like a eyeball-looking structure at the tip of the wings on the back. So you can imagine that that would be a false deterrent for birds of prey that might come and try and attack the butterfly. They would incorrectly go for that eyeball instead of the head. So even though the wing might get a little messed up, that's better than completely losing your head. So can we see evolution occur right before us? Partly, yes. We can see natural selection. Here's an example that is relevant to you. So antibiotic resistance, you've probably heard about. You've probably heard of MRSA, bacteria that we can't really effectively kill with the drugs that we now have available, and it's becoming a big problem in hospitals. So how does this happen? Well, if we start to the left at box number 1, you have a bunch of different bacteria. Let's say it's Staphylococcus, so a staph infection. So you have a bunch of staph, and included in that staph is one individual that has a mutation that made it resistant to antibiotics. So in box 2, when somebody comes into the hospital, gets an antibiotic, most of the bacteria are going to be killed. A few might survive depending on how high a dose or how long of a regimen you gave of that antibiotic, but the resistant guy is going to be doing really well. So then in box 3, you see that the resistant guy is going to be multiplying a lot. It's going to produce a lot of offspring. It's going to become more common in the population than it was in box 1. And then by box 4, eventually the entire infection evolves into a resistant strain. So how did the first bacteria become resistant to the antibiotic? And the answer would be mutations. So mutations are random, so some mutation randomly arose that was beneficial to the staph in the context of being antibiotic resistant. So the environmental factor was antibiotics, the phenotype was being antibiotic resistant, and the genotype was a mutation in that staph. So what happened in that case? Well, in a word, evolution. That is, there was a genetic change in the population of staph in the population on that human being. This evolution example is the result of natural selection. So we'll discuss natural selection in more detail later, but the consequence of certain individual organisms in a population being born with characteristics that enable them to survive better and reproduce more than the offspring of other individuals in the population. That would be natural selection. So this experiment example answers a question that is sometimes perceived as complex or controversial. Does evolution occur? Well, the answer is an unambiguous yes. We can watch it in the lab whenever we want. So if we want to start studying a new antibiotic that we think might be better than the ones already out on the market, this is what we would do. We would take a bunch of bacteria, grow it up in the lab, and see if we can kill it off with that antibiotic or not. Recall from our discussion that the scientific method in chapter 1 that for an experiment's results to be valid, they must be reproducible. To be certain of these results, researchers carried out a lot of experiments to support evolution, and it's very repeatable, and that's why we call it a theory. Because remember, a theory is not just a guess, and it's not a hypothesis. It's something that has been repeatedly as close to proven as can be by the scientific community. In this chapter, we examine how evolution can occur and the type of changes it can cause in a population. We'll also go over the 5 primary lines of evidence that indicate that evolution and natural selection are processes that help us to better understand all other ideas and facts in biology. Evolution isn't optional to biology. Without evolution, there would not be the study of biology. It's a fundamental foundation for this branch of science. Here's the take-home messages. The characteristics of individuals present in a population can change over time. So we saw that change in the population becoming having more antibiotic-resistant individuals than at the start. We can observe such change in nature and can even cause it to occur. So selective breeding would be an example of dogs, of crops, things like that. Charles Darwin, you may have heard of. You probably learned about him in school, but he grew up in an orderly world in Victorian British society. And at that time, many beliefs about humans and our place in the world had changed little over the previous 2 centuries. Biblical explanations were sufficient for most natural phenomena. Most people thought the earth was about 6,000 years old. And with the occasional exception of a flood or earthquake or volcanic eruption, the earth was believed to be mostly unchanging. People did recognize that organisms existed in groups called species or kinds. So that actually started with Aristotle. Aristotle's the first one who started grouping organisms into categories that he thought were similar. But that's a key point, is that the society at Darwin's time believed the earth to be mostly unchanging, static. So people in Darwin's society also generally believe that all species, including humans, have been created at the same time, and that once created, they never changed and never died out. So that gives you some context. So in 1831, Darwin landed a dream job, a position as a gentleman companion for a captain on the HMS Beagle, which was a 5-year around-the-world surveying expedition. So a lot of people don't know this, that Darwin actually studied theology. He was supposed to become a priest. He was also supposed to become a medical student. He kind of bounced around different careers until he landed on this opportunistic journey on the HMS Beagle. Why am I telling you about this? Well, it's the places that he went, the observations that Darwin made, that are the underpinnings of the theory of evolution. So that's what I'm showing you there in that map. He went all over the world. It was a 5-year journey. He's most famous for what he noticed at the Galapagos Islands. So to avoid seasickness, Darwin spent as much time as possible on shore. It was there he found that field work was his true calling. At each stop, he would eagerly investigate the new worlds he found. In Brazil, he was enthralled by tropical forests. In Patagonia, he explored beaches and cliffs, finding spectacular fossils from huge extinct mammals. Elsewhere, he explored coral reefs and barnacles, always packing up specimens for museums and recording his observations. So just like how Mendel recorded all these observations about the garden pea, Darwin is running around the world recording his observations. In the Galapagos Islands, he noticed some observations about finches. So he saw a resemblance of island finch species to mainland finch species. So he actually documented, I think it's 19 species of island finch. And he saw that although those finches found on the Galapagos Islands had slightly different characteristics from each other, they still resembled the single mainland finch. So what are some of those observations you notice that's different between those Galapagos finches down there? One observation people tend to give me is that their beaks look different. And that would be a really good one. Compared to the mainland finch, they look very similar though. So he noted different physical characteristics or traits, or we could say phenotypes, such as body size, beak shape, or feather color. Another key observation of Darwin's was that he saw resemblance of extinct species to living species in the same area. So when he went to shore, not only saw living species, but he sometimes found fossils. So one example would be in Argentina, he found some giant fossils from a group of organisms called glyptodonts. And these extinct glyptodonts looked just like armadillos, a species that was still flourishing in Argentina. However, they were way bigger than the present-day armadillo, averaging more than 4,000 pounds compared to the 10 pounds of the average armadillo. So he deduced that if glidodonts had lived in South America in the past and armadillos were currently living there, why was only one of the species still alive? Why didn't we still have giant armadillos? And why were the glyptodont fossils found only in the same places where modern armadillos live? So he deduced that glyptodonts resembled armadillos because they were their ancient relatives. It was a logical deduction, but it contradicted the scientific dogma of the day that species were unchanging and that extinction did not occur. So in conclusion for this section, talking about his round the world journey and his survey of fossils and animals, that he noted unexpected patterns among those fossils and animals. And all of these observations helped Darwin develop his theory of how species might change over time. So now we'll talk about the mechanisms that can give rise to evolution. So evolution is a theory. The end result is a change in the gene pool that we talked about at the beginning. But how does it happen? What's the mechanism that makes it happen? Okay, again, definition of evolution. So it occurs when the allele frequencies in a population change. What do I mean by allele frequencies? Well, you should know the word allele from the previous 2 chapters. So an allele is just a variation on a gene, right? So you have 2 alleles, you have 2 genes, one from your mom, one from your dad. The frequency would be how common that allele is. So in the case of the antibiotic-resistant Staphylococcus, at the beginning, that allele frequency for resistance was really, really low. But then when that environmental pressure of the antibiotic got thrown onto it, the allele frequency shifted to being really high in the population because those were the only ones that were surviving and producing a bunch of offspring. So suppose you are put in charge of a large population of tigers in a zoo. Virtually all of them are orange and brown with black stripes, but occasionally unusual all-white tigers are born. This white phenotype is the result of possessing a rare pair of alleles that suppress the production of most fur pigment. So if we go back to the last chapter, that would be homozygous recessive individuals. Because visitors flock to zoos to see the white tigers, you want to increase the proportion of your tiger population that is white. How would you go about doing that? So remember, evolution is a change in allele frequencies. So that top pie chart is showing you the proportion of orange tigers to the proportion of white tigers. As a zookeeper, you can use selective breeding to keep putting pressure, environmental pressure, on shifting the population towards having more white tigers. And that's what that flow chart of those different pie charts is showing you down at the bottom. So you could alter the population by trying to produce more animals with the white phenotype. In this case, your best strategy would be to try to breed the white tigers with each other, and then over time this would lead to more and more white tigers. So you alter the population, and then as the generations go by, it takes time, but you would see a higher proportion, a higher allele frequency for that white tiger. That end result is called evolution. So it's a change on the allele frequencies of the population. The 4 mechanisms are mutation, genetic drift, migration, and natural selection. Mutation we talked about a couple chapters ago. And we'll talk more about that in a second. Okay, a mutation is a direct change in the DNA of an individual. Ultimately, this is the source of all genetic variation. Okay, so when we say there's different alleles for a gene, well, they originally all had the same gene code. They had the same exact A's and T's and G's and C's. But some mutation arose naturally. It just randomly happens. It changed the coding of those letters, and then you get a different allele entirely because you have a different product for that gene then. How does mutation occur? Examples we talked about was errors during DNA replication. So in interphase, you will have to replicate all of your DNA to undergo cell division. So that's billions of base pairs that enzymes have to get correctly put together to replicate the DNA, and sometimes it just makes a mistake. Imagine if you had to copy a whole library of books onto paper, you would probably make a couple of mistakes. So that would be a mutation. Another way would be environmental. So you could have a radiation, for example, that directly comes in and breaks bonds in your DNA, those hydrogen bonds that hold those nucleotides together, and can change them completely. So when we're talking about these mechanisms of evolution, it's helpful to keep the precise definition of evolution in mind. That was a change in the allele frequency found in a population. Okay, so the technical definition for mutation is an alteration of the base pair sequence of an individual's DNA. And when this alteration occurs in a section of the DNA that codes for a particular gene, the changes in the DNA sequence may change the allele. So for example, a mutation changes one of the two blue-eyed alleles that an individual possesses into a brown-eye allele. If that mutation occurs in the sperm or the egg-producing cells, it can be passed on to the next generation. The offspring may be born carrying the brown-eye allele. When that happens, the proportion of blue-eyed alleles in the population is slightly reduced, and the proportion of the brown-eye alleles is slightly increased, so evolution has occurred. So mutations are only going to be agents of evolution if that mutation happens in the egg or the sperm cells, because it has to be passed on to the next generation. So those somatic cells, remember what those are? Those are the cells that make up your body. It's everything but your reproductive cells. Mutations in there aren't going to have effects on the next generation. But if something happens in my reproductive cells and I have a whole new allele happen because of a mutation, I could pass that on to my offspring. Okay, so just remember, only mutations that affect reproductive cells can be inherited, and so we consider only those mutations as altering the allele frequencies within a population. So mutations are random. I had a student ask me about that recently. They said, well, how does your cell know that it should mutate so that it's better to adapt to live in an environment? Well, it didn't know. It was completely a freak thing. So that antibiotic resistance wasn't the bacteria like wanting to be resistant. By chance, a mutation arose that just happened to make it more resistant. And then when it's in the environment of getting hit with a bunch of antibiotics, it was advantageous to it, so it kept passing down that allele. In addition to being a mechanism of evolutionary change, mutation has another more important role relevant to all mechanisms of evolution, including natural selection. It is the ultimate source of genetic variation in a population. All genetic variation comes from mutations. We saw that a mutation may lead to the conversion of one allele to another that is already found within the population, as in our blue eye and brown eye example. More important, though, is that a mutation can create a completely novel allele that codes for the production of a new protein. For this reason, mutation is critical to natural selection, because variation is the raw material for natural selection, and it must initially come from mutation. All right, so here is reminding you of the definition of a mutation, and that it happens in only when it happens in the gamete-producing cells is that going to affect evolution. And this is so important. Again, I've said it multiple times, but just remember that section in red. All right, another mechanism after mutation is genetic drift, which is a random change in allele frequencies in a population. So random is the key word here. So once a mutation happens, you have different alleles running around the population. Genetic drift would be a random change in that allele frequency. There's different examples of this. One is founder effect. So this would be when a small number of individuals may leave a population and then they become the founding members of a new isolated population. So if those founders have different allele frequencies than the original source population, then a shift in the allele frequency has occurred. Because the founding members of the new population will give rise to all the subsequent individuals, The new population will be dominated by genetic features that happen to be present in those founding fathers and mothers. That type of genetic drift is called the founder effect. Here's an example of that. The Amish population in the United States is believed to have been established by a small number of founders who happened to carry the allele for polydactyly, which means another extra finger, poly, mini, dactyly, digit, extra digits. The condition of having extra fingers and toes, and as a consequence today this trait, while it is still rare, occurs more frequently among the Amish than among the general population of the United States. So the Amish people tend to marry amongst themselves, and we see that the allele frequency is disproportionately high in Amish people because those founders had that allele. Now, if the founding population, nobody had an allele for polydactyly to spread around to subsequent generations, then we wouldn't see this disproportionate amount of polydactyly in the Amish population. So when you have a small founding group of people, what alleles they have become really important. Another example of genetic drift would be bottlenecks. This would be because occasionally a famine, a disease, or rapid environmental change causes the death of a large proportion of the population, sometimes as much as 90% or more. So because that population is reduced to a small fraction of its original size, it's called a bottleneck. Just such a population bottleneck occurred in the cheetah near the end of the last ice age about 10,000 years ago. Although the cause is unknown, possibly environmental cataclysm or human hunting pressure, it appears that nearly all cheetahs died. Although the population has rebounded, all cheetahs living today can trace their ancestry back to a dozen or so lucky individuals that survived that bottleneck event. As a result of this past instance of evolution by genetic drift, there is almost no genetic variation left in the current population of cheetahs. So the point of genetic drift is going to decrease your allele frequency. It's going to decrease your amount of genetic variation. All right, let's look at an example. The American bison, or buffalo, was hunted to near extinction by early settlers. Which answer is correct about the current population of American bison? So go ahead and pause it while you think about the answer. The answer is number 1. It has experienced a bottleneck. So that catastrophic event was overhunting. So number 1 is correct. Number 2 is not correct because there's a decrease in diversity. Anytime you have a bottleneck, you're going to have a decrease in diversity, like when we talked about the cheetahs. And then number 3, it's not a founder effect. That's completely different. So genetic drift, again, the definition is a random change in allele frequencies within a population. And it is a significant mechanism of evolutionary change, particularly when we're talking about small populations. The third mechanism is migration. I don't have a lot of slides about that because it's really self-explanatory. Migration into an area, a new area that a species wasn't in before, leads to a change in the allele frequencies in a population because individuals are moving into or out of that population. The fourth agent of evolutionary change is natural selection. That's the mechanism that Darwin identified in The Origin of Species. That's the famous book of his that started this whole theory of evolution thing. And he noted in The Origin of Species that 3 conditions are necessary for natural selection to occur. Here are the 3 conditions. Number 1, there must be variation for the trait within the population. Okay, so you have to have different alleles. Number 2, that variation must be heritable. That's a typo. Heritable, meaning that variation must be able to be passed on to the next generation through egg and sperm cells. And then the key, number 3, is individuals with one version of the trait must produce more offspring than those with a different version of the trait. So if we go back to that Staphylococcus antibiotic resistance example, naturally in the population, a mutation arose that led to variation for the trait of being resistant or not. So that's number 1. Number 2, that variation was heritable because bacteria undergo mitosis. They don't have sexual reproduction, so everything it has in its genome, its daughter cells will have. Then number 3, the antibiotic resistant traits, those offspring, were much more likely to survive because they could be resistant to the antibiotic. So they continued generation after generation to produce more offspring. So the first condition was the variation for a trait. It's not limited to physical features such as fur color or face shape. Organisms vary in physiological and biochemical ways too. There's also behavioral variation. The second of the conditions necessary for natural selection was being able to pass on that trait, or heritability. So we call the transmission of traits from parents to their children through genetic information inheritance, or you could say heritability. Darwin derived the third condition of natural selection from 3 fairly simple observations that he made. So now we have like a list of 3 within a list of 3. So he noticed that there are more organisms born than can survive. He noticed that organisms are continually struggling for existence. And then he noticed that some organisms are more likely to win the struggle and survive and reproduce. So animals die all the time. That's because there's too many of them. We keep reproducing, and some of them die. But which ones actually go on to live will be the ones that have the most resources. If you have the most resources, you don't die, you can produce offspring. So here's an example. The runt of the litter, or the tiniest dog in the litter, has reduced differential reproductive success, meaning it is less likely to reproduce, and its more robust siblings are getting a lot more of that mom's food. They're going to thrive and grow. They're going to be more likely to reproduce than the runt of the litter. Natural selection, certainly one of the most influential and far-reaching ideas in the history of science, occurs when 3 basic conditions are met. 1, variation for a trait. 2, heritability of that trait. 3, differential reproductive success based on that trait. That just means have more offspring. When these 3 conditions are satisfied, evolution by natural selection is occurring. Okay, so natural selection is a result, evolution is a result, natural selection is the mechanism that gets you that result. Over time, the traits that lead some organisms to have greater reproductive success than others will increase in frequency in a population, while traits that reduce reproductive success will fade away. And that's your definition for evolution, was a change in that allele frequency. Okay, so there's those 3 different things that have to be met to be natural selection. I'm asking you in this example, which of the 3 is this example? Is it variation in a trait, heritability of that trait, differential reproductive success on that trait, or all of the above? Go ahead and pause while you think of the answer. The answer is number 1, because I'm not telling you about the offspring. I'm not telling you about the reproductive success, and I'm not telling you if this is even occurring in germ cells, whatever allele is allowing them to live longer or not. So this is just a variation in the trait. There's a variation in how long the fruit fly can live without food. So natural selection is a mechanism of evolution. And through natural selection, populations of organisms can become adapted to their environment. We see this all the time, like that example of the moth with that eyeball on its wings. Another one here is a harp seal pup. It has a white coat. It helps it hide from polar bears. You could probably think of a lot of examples of adaptations. Traits causing some individuals to have more offspring than others become more prevalent in the population. This is kind of where the survival of the fittest comes in. I don't really love that way of putting it, but you've probably heard that. So taken literally, if you say survival of the fittest and you take it literally, it seems to be circular. Like those organisms that survive must be the fittest. If being fit is defined as the ability to survive. But we'll see in evolution actually that the word fitness is not defined by an organism's ability to survive, or its physical strength, or its health. Rather, in the context of evolution, fitness has everything to do with an organism's reproductive success. That's what I mean by fitness, is reproductive success. So if you have two toads, well, actually, let's use the Staphylococcus example again, the antibiotic resistance. If you have a staph bacteria that is not resistant, and you have one that is resistant, and then you dump a bunch of antibiotics on it, which organism has better fitness? Well, that antibiotic resistant allele carrying one does, because it's going to go on to have a bunch of offspring. So it has more offspring than the other guy, so it has better fitness. The alleles carried by an individual with high fitness will increase their market share in a population over time, and the population will evolve. Okay, so you got the allele because of a mutation. That allele gave some sort of benefit to that individual, which then let that individual reproduce more, so it had higher fitness. And if it's reproducing more, it's going to take over more and more of the population, and then you're going to have more and more of that allele running around. The end result of that is evolution, because it's a change in the allele frequency. First off, an individual's fitness is measured relative to other genotype or phenotypes in the population. So those traits that confer on an individual the highest fitness will generally increase their market share in a population. Their increase will always come at the expense of the market share of alternative traits that confer lower fitness. Number 2, fitness depends on the specific environment in which the organism lives. So if you're a brown squirrel and you live in an environment that's brown, you're going to be better camouflaged, you don't get eaten, you don't die, you have more offspring, you have more fitness. Now you take that same brown squirrel and you put it in like a sandy white environment, it's going to get killed off, it's not going to reproduce. Okay, so the fitness depends on the environment. Also, the fitness depends on an organism's reproductive success compared to other organisms in the population. So if you carry an allele that gives you the trait of surviving for 200 years, but that allele also causes you to be sterile and incapable of producing offspring, your fitness is 0. Because that allele will never be passed down to future generation, and its market share will soon be 0. On the other hand, if you inherit an allele that gives you a trait that causes you to die at half the age of everyone else, but also causes you to have twice as many offspring as the average person while you are alive, then your fitness is increased. So that's just telling you again that is reproductive success that is most important for determining whether particular traits increase their market share. Let's take an example of humans. Let's say we got some big tough guy who's like really good at surviving, but no women really want to date him or mate with him. Well, he may survive and be super fit, but he is not going to have high reproductive success. If we have a guy that's not really that strong, but he's a really good guy and he is very likable to a lot of women, well, maybe he'll have a lot of offspring and have much higher reproductive success, whether he looks physically fit or not. So go ahead and think about this one, pause the video so you can answer it. So the answer is number 5. Remember, anytime you have a decrease or increase of one allele, you're going to have a opposite effect on the other one. And remember that the fitness depends on the environment in which the individual lives. That's what that example showed you. Organisms in a population can become better matched to their environment through natural selection. Darwin noted over and over again during his travels that organisms that possess traits that allow them to better exploit the environment in which they live tend to produce more offspring than the organisms with those alternative traits. With passing generations, a population will be made up more and more of those more fit organisms, and as a consequence, organisms will tend to be increasingly well matched or adapted to their environment. The word adaptation refers to both the process by which organisms become better matched to their environment and the specific features that make an organism more fit. Examples of adaptations abound. So bats have extremely accurate hearing for navigating and finding food, even in complete darkness. That's an adaptation. Porcupine quills make porcupines almost impervious to predation, shown here in this picture. That would be an adaptation as well. I would say true. We didn't necessarily adapt to be the best at living in harsh environments. We're pretty squishy. We don't have any fur on us. Our offspring are incredibly high maintenance, and we can only have typically one at a time. But what we have as an adaptation that other animals do not is our extreme intelligence. Artificial selection. So this is a special case of natural selection where we are coming in and we are forcing the change versus it's just naturally happening because of changes in the environment. So this is the process used by animal breeders and farmers. But the underlying genetic process does not differ from natural selection because the three conditions are satisfied. Artificial selection is considered a special case of natural selection because the differential reproductive success is being determined by humans rather than by nature. For example, apple growers use artificial selection to produce the wide variety of apples now available. The important thing to remember, though, is that still it's dealing with differential reproductive success, and the results are no different. Example, we have bred turkeys through artificial selection to have really big breasts. Why? The breast meat is delicious. We want to sell that turkey at the grocery store, buy it, and eat it up. Well, that's not natural. They have been artificially made that way through increasing that allele frequency for having that large breasts because farmers went in and forced that. In fact, it's so not natural that their breasts are too big to allow turkeys to naturally reproduce. So turkeys on poultry farms can no longer mate naturally, and artificial insemination is required. So that's just kind of an extreme example of artificial selection. But it's the same result, differential reproductive success. There's a lot of evidence for evolution. There's 5 lines of it. You should know a couple of examples for the test. And in the nearly 150 years since Darwin first published The Origin of Species, thousands of experiments involving his theory of evolution by natural selection have been conducted, both in the laboratory and in natural habitats. A wide range of modern methodologies has also been developed, all contributing to a deeper understanding of the process of evolution. This ongoing accumulation of evidence overwhelmingly supports the basic premise that Darwin put forward, while filling in many of the gaps that frustrated him. Here we review the 5 primary lines of evidence demonstrating the occurrence of evolution. We have the fossil record, or the physical evidence of organisms that lived in the past. We have biogeography, which is patterns in the geographic distribution of living organisms. We have comparative anatomy and embryology, which is the growth, development, and body structures of major groups of organisms. Molecular biology, which is looking at the DNA level. And laboratory and field experiments. The first of the 5 lines of evidence is the fossil record. Although it has been central to much documentation of the occurrence of evolution, it is a very incomplete record. After all, the soft parts of an organism almost always decay rapidly and completely after death. There are only a few unique environments, such as tar pits, for example, in which the forces of decomposition are reduced so that an organism's hard parts like bones, teeth, shells can be preserved for thousands or even millions of years. These remains are called fossils, and they can be used to reconstruct what organisms must have looked like long ago. So this is a fossil of something that you might be wondering, is it a bird? Is it a dinosaur? Is it a reptile? Well, it's actually a transitional form between modern birds and reptiles. The use of radiometric dating also helps in further painting a picture of organisms' evolutionary history by telling us the age of the rock in which the fossil has been found, so we can figure out how old fossils are. The evolutionary history of horses is the most well preserved in the fossil record. So first appearing in North America about 55 million years ago, we know that through the radiometric dating. Much of the horse diversity disappeared, leaving only a single group of species called Equus Because there is only one group of species that occur on Earth today, it is tempting to imagine a simple linear path from modern horses straight back through their 55 million year evolutionary history. But that's just not how evolution works. In reality, there have been numerous branches of horses that have split off over evolutionary time, flourished for millions of years, only recently going extinct. What we see living today is only a single branch on a greatly branched evolutionary tree. Similar thing with humans. A lot of people think we evolved directly from like cavemen or Neanderthals. Well, there were other species of humanoids running around at the same time as Neanderthals, and they died out, whereas other species continue to flourish and evolve into our species today. The fossil record provides another valuable piece of evidence for the process of natural selection in the form of missing links. So those are fossils that demonstrate a link between groups of species believed to have shared a common ancestor. Here's an example of one such missing link. So first found in northern Canada and estimated at 375 million years old, this fossil appears to represent a transitional species between fish and land animals. These creatures had gills, scales, and fins like fish, but they also had arm-like joints in their fins and could drag their body across land much the way a marine mammal such as a seal can. Alright, so this is talking about radiometric dating, analyze fossil remains. More evidence for evolution is the study of the distribution patterns of living organisms around the world, and that's called biogeography. The patterns of biogeography that Darwin and many researchers since have noticed provide strong evidence that evolutionary forces are responsible for them. Species often more closely resemble other species that live less than 100 miles away, but in radically different habitats than they do species that live thousands of miles away in nearly identical habitats. On Hawaii, for example, nearly every bird is some sort of modified honey creeper. There are seed-eating honey creepers, woodpecker honey creepers, curve-billed nectar-feeding ones. There are even parrot honey creepers. So this would be similar evidence as those finches on the Galapagos Islands. If you observe any vertebrate embryo, it will pass through a stage in which it has little gill pouches on the sides of the neck. Any vertebrate, so that's including humans. It will pass through the stage in which it possesses a long bony tail. Also true of humans, all the vertebrates. This is true whether it's a human embryo or that of a turtle or a chicken or a shark. These gill pouches disappear before birth in all but the fishes. Similarly, we don't actually find humans with tails. So why does the embryo have a stage where it has a tail or gills? Well, such common embryological stages indicate that the organisms share a common ancestor from which they have all been modified. Study of these developmental stages in the adult body forms of organism provide our third line of evidence, helping us to see that evolution occurs and better understand the process. So that was embryos, but among adults there's several features of anatomy that reveal the ghost of evolution in action. For example, we find that related organisms often show unusual similarities that can only be explained through evolutionary relatedness. So the forelimbs of mammals are used for a variety of functions in bats, porpoises, horses, and humans. So that would be called comparative anatomy. If each had been designed specifically for the uses necessary to that species, we would expect dramatically different designs, and yet in each of these species we see the same bones, modified extensively, that betray the fact that they share a common ancestor. Those structures are called homologous structures. Same thing with us, our hips, we share with apes, and apes do not walk upright. They are hunched over, right, and they're kind of on all fours more of the time than not, whereas we walk upright all the time. Well, our hips are actually not perfectly formed to stand upright and walk upright all the time. So that's why running can eventually be bad on your hips. Go ahead and answer this. The answer is homologous structures. So similarities in the anatomy and development of different groups of organisms reveal common evolutionary origins. Molecular biology, this is fairly recent. So these are new technologies for deciphering and comparing the genetic code, and that's our fourth line of evidence. First and foremost is the fact that all living organisms share the same genetic code, which was those nucleic acids, right? From microscopic bacteria to flowering plants to insects and primates to humans, the molecular instructions for building organisms and transmitting hereditary information are the same. Those 4 simple base pairs arranged in an almost unlimited variety of sequences. So that discovery strongly suggests that all living organisms are related. We can measure the DNA similarity between 2 species by comparing their DNA sequences for individual genes. Okay, so if you were to compare the hemoglobin DNA sequence, so hemoglobin is a protein, DNA is the recipe for it. If you compare that sequence to a monkey, a rhesus monkey specifically, versus you compare that sequence to a dog, the sequences are going to be much more similar between the human and the monkey than the human and the dog. Okay, so in the case of the hemoglobin of humans versus rhesus monkeys, there are 12 different amino acids. Remember those codons from the DNA code for amino acids? Whereas in the dog, we're going to see 32 different amino acids, so 20 more changes. Then if we go further out and look at non-mammals such as birds, we'd see 45 amino acid changes between humans and birds. And if we look at even further out, lamprey eels, eels are vertebrates, but they evolved more than 450 million years ago. There are 125 amino acid differences. So the more differences there are in the DNA between 2 species, the longer ago they evolved from each other. Go ahead and answer this question. It might take you a couple minutes, so definitely pause the video here. Okay, and the answer is number 1. Why? Because there's 4 differences there, and this is actually for a baboon. The next one has 5 changes. That's a lemur. The next one is a chicken. It has 7 changes, and a frog also has 7 changes. So based on the differences in the amino acid sequence of the hemoglobin, to which animal listed below are humans most closely related? And the example would be a dog, because there's 32 changes versus the 45 in the bird and the 125 in the lamprey, which is a type of eel. Okay, so now you need to also look at the bottom of this graph and try and interpret this information to answer, when did humans and birds last share a common ancestor? The answer is 112 million years ago. Versus if we go out and look at that eel, the common ancestor was 564 million years ago, so a lot longer. And that's why we have a lot more differences between us and an eel, because it's been a longer time. So all living things share the genetic code, and the degree of similarity in the DNA of different species can reveal how closely related they are and the amount of time that has passed since they last shared a common ancestor. And you might be wondering, like, how can that tell you anything about time? That's because mutations are random, but they are consistent. So DNA replicates, and we can calculate the error rate that happens on average. So if you look at the accumulations of the mutations over time, that can tell you how much time has passed. Laboratory and field experiments enable us to watch evolution in progress. We kind of already went over an example of this. So here is Staphylococcus aureus on a plate. This is giving you just a more specific example of what we went over at the beginning. Here they're talking about penicillin, and you're seeing the staph growing on a plate of human blood. So if we were to take Staphylococcus that we froze down in the 1940s, and we plate that bacteria out in the lab, and we throw some penicillin on it, that little pill is a penicillin pill, we'll see a lot of Staphylococcus is killed, especially close to the penicillin. If we then take a Staphylococcus sample from a person now, we see very little killing by that penicillin. And that correlates with what we know. We know that penicillin is not the best antibiotic anymore because the resistance has increased more and more and more as the years go by. An interesting question that someone's asked me too is, doesn't evolution take a long time? So how can you use bacteria as an example? Excellent question. It does take a long time, but it's relative to what the time is of that species to reproduce. So if we're talking about you have a mutation, it makes an allele, then you pass it on to offspring. So we're talking about offspring over time, changing the allele frequency equaling evolution. Then E. coli have a doubling time, so they reproduce every 20 minutes versus a human. So I can grow up millions and millions of bacteria in an 8-hour period, and I could look at mutations just from the end of 8 hours to the beginning. And if I go and take that out even longer, from the 1940s to today, like the last example, you're going to see mutations happen, and you're going to see changes in the allele frequency in the population that we would never see in humans in that same amount of time. We have not evolved since 1940s. Okay, chapter 9, talking about evolution again, but this time we're going to talk about behavior. These are the sections you're responsible for. You need to know that behaviors are traits, and that can evolve. We think of them as really complicated, so we don't think they can, but they can, because they are traits. Everything has a genetic underpinning. We'll talk about altruism. We'll talk about sexual conflict and reproductive investment by males and females, and we'll talk about communications. Behaviors are traits that can evolve. So here we see a macaque monkey hanging upside down on a branch to take a sip of water. So that is a behavior, which is defined as encompassing any and all of the actions performed by an organism, often in response to its environment or to actions of another organism. Feeding behavior is one such example of a behavior. What do you choose to eat? The scope of animals' behavior is vast and varied. There's an impressively long list of well-studied topics. Scientists have studied conflict, aggression, territorialness, cooperation, alliance building, competing for food and predators, avoiding predators, migration, body temperature. We could keep going. Mate choice, fidelity, parental behavior, communication, learning. Okay, so think about which food you would pick and why did you choose that specific food? The answer is, if you're really hungry, don't you also go for easily obtainable high-calorie items? Right? So that's a behavior. You can even understand complex behaviors like cooperation, selfishness, and altruism by having an evolutionary lens or approach. If we look closely, we see many behaviors in the animal world that appear to be altruistic behaviors. That is, they seem to come at a cost to the individual performing them while benefiting a recipient. When discussing altruism, we define costs and benefits in terms of their contribution to an individual's fitness. Such altruistic appearing behavior is common enough in the natural world that it puzzled Darwin. Natural selection, he believed, generally works to produce selfish behavior. The alleles that cause the individual carrying them to have the greatest reproductive success should increase their market share. That is, the proportion of all the alleles for that gene within the population. At At the same time, alleles that cause the individuals carrying them to help increase others' individuals' reproductive success should decrease. Okay, so put in another way, natural selection should never produce altruistic behavior. So Darwin was really confused. He worried that if the apparent instances of altruism were indeed truly altruistic, they would prove fatal to his theory. Are they? All right, let's take a case of the Australian spider. After giving birth to spiderlings, the mother's body slowly liquefies so that the newborn spiders can consume her. So over the course of 40 days, her offspring literally eat her alive, ultimately killing their mother. But it seems altruistic, but what's the advantage? The advantage is her offspring are well nourished. They start their lives pretty fit. Fit in this case meaning physically. The cost to the mother is huge. She's unable to produce any more offspring, but there's a clear benefit to the recipients. Okay, so really the goal of all of life is just keep reproducing your genes. So she wasn't really being altruistic. She was trying to set up her offspring for the best success possible. So as it turns out, Darwin's theory is safe. Virtually all the apparent acts of altruism in the animal kingdom, upon closer inspection, are not truly altruistic, but instead have evolved as a consequence of either kin selection or reciprocal altruism. Kin selection is kindness toward close relatives. Reciprocal altruism is kindness toward unrelated individuals. So both kin selection and reciprocal altruism can lead to the evolution of behaviors that are apparently altruistic, but in actuality are beneficial to the individual engaging in the behavior from an evolutionary perspective. So does true altruism exist? Is there an evolutionary motivation for it? Kin selection. The idea that one individual assisting another could compensate for its own decrease in fitness if it helped a close relative in a way that increased the relative's fitness. So altruistic appearing behaviors will most likely occur when the benefits to close relatives are greater than the cost of the individual. The more closely related you are, the more likely you are to perform an altruistic act as well. Right? So let's take an example. I work with kids in the foster care system. People are more willing to take on a child and adopt it if it's blood related to them, versus if an individual is completely unrelated. They're less likely to want to adopt that child. Here's an example of kin selection. So at a great risk to herself, this squirrel is making an alarm call in response to a predator. So if you're being really loud and there's a predator around, you're probably going to get eaten by that predator. But the compromise was that all of your squirrel family is able to hide and not get eaten. Okay, so that's kin selection. It is ironic that the study of altruism in the world reveals that natural selection has primarily produced selfish behavior among animals. As we saw in the previous section, when behavior appears altruistic, it frequently is because individuals are helping kin, and by doing so, sorry, I lost my train of thought. In this section, we explore the conditions that give rise to reciprocal altruism, how it may have arisen, and why it is so common among humans, but so rare among other animal species. So one species with well-documented altruistic appearing behavior is vampire bats. So this is more common in humans, but there are examples in animals like vampire bats. So they live in social groups of 8 to 12, mostly unrelated adults, and they roost primarily in caves and hollow trees. They feed by landing on large mammals such as cattle, horses, and pigs, piercing the skin with their razor-sharp teeth and drinking the blood that flows from the wound. So vampire bats must consume almost their entire body weight in blood every single night. If they go for more than about 60 hours without finding a meal, they are likely to die from starvation. So here's where the apparent altruism comes in. A bat that has not found food and is close to death will beg food from a bat that has recently eaten. In many cases, the bat that has just eaten will regurgitate some of the blood it has consumed into the mouth of the hungry bat, saving it from starvation. This act obviously is very high benefit to the sharing bat, which loses some of the caloric content of a meal it has just gained. Why would that do that? So how might this behavior have arisen? To answer the question, it's important to note 3 other features of vampire bats. First, vampire bats are able to recognize more than 100 distinct individuals. Second, bats that receive blood donations from non-relatives reciprocate significantly more than average. And third, bats that are not familiar with each other generally do not regurgitate for each other. So essentially it's like, I kind of know you, I'm going to help you out now, so you can help me out later. I scratch your back, you scratch mine. That would be an example of reciprocal altruism. One method proposed to explain the evolution of this apparent altruism is that the bats giving blood to other bats in need are repaid the favor when they are in need of blood later. Therefore, the act only appears selfless when it actually is selfish. So with reciprocal altruism, both individuals give up something of relatively low value in exchange for getting something of great value at a later time when they need it. In other words, they are storing goodwill in another individual, much the way a person might put money in a bank for a rainy day. In both cases, individuals are protected from some of the world's uncertainties. Reciprocal altruism can evolve as certain conditions are met. 1, repeated interactions among individuals with opportunities to be both the donor and the recipient of altruistic appearing acts, so you're more likely to help someone out that you know better than a complete stranger. Number 2, benefits to the recipient that are significantly greater than the costs to the donor. So if I have $1 million and you need $10 to survive, I'll probably give you $10. But if I have $10 and you need $10, that's a bigger risk to me as the donor. I don't know if I'm going to give it to you. That would be number 2. Number 3 is the ability to recognize and punish cheaters. In other words, individuals that are recipients of altruistic appearing acts but do not return the favor. So if there's some guy that a lot of people help out and he never helps anyone out in return, people are going to stop helping him. In the absence of these conditions, selfishness is expected to be the norm among unrelated individuals. In the presence of all 3 conditions, on the other hand, reciprocity masquerading as altruism is likely to occur, as it did among the vampire bats. As rare as it is in other species, reciprocal altruism is very common among humans. Friendships among other human relationships is built on reciprocity and is almost universal. The opportunity for friendship may be enhanced as a consequence of our long lifespan and our ability to recognize thousands of faces and keep track of cheaters. These features are essential in people engaging in reciprocal altruism because an individual becomes very vulnerable when she or he acts in an altruistic manner toward an unrelated individual. The risk is that the altruism will not be repaid, in which case the cheater enjoys greater fitness than the altruist. The importance of keeping track of cheaters and identifying good potential reciprocity partners, people you kind of want to have be your friends, may be why humans are so interested in social information and trivial gossip. So as with many of the complex behaviors of humans, they probably use some basic rules when making decisions about reciprocal altruism, which might include keeping track of all available social information to best identify any promising individuals with whom to engage in altruism. This includes information about health, generosity, social status, and reproduction. All right, go ahead and answer this question. The answer is number 4. So donating money for cancer research, it's common. Maybe one day you're going to get cancer, so that would be reciprocal altruism. Friends helping each other with childcare, there's obviously a direct benefit to everyone in that situation. But people are less likely to donate money to someone way far away that's really has no chances of helping them back in return. Now, we do see those examples. So I would argue that there is a limitation to this argument of reciprocal altruism. I do think that we see acts of true altruism that are very hard to explain by evolutionary means solely. So kin selection and reciprocal altruism can evolve in a population of animals. As a consequence, casual observers of nature frequently see individuals acting in ways that appear altruistic. But these people are really just acting from the perspective of evolutionary fitness in their own selfish interest. This nearly universal selfishness raises the question of whether evolution ever leads to behaviors that are good for the species or population but detrimental to the individual exhibiting the behavior. That's a process called group selection. It might seem that evolution would favor individuals that behave in a manner that benefits the group, even if it comes at a cost to the individual's reproductive success. But this does not happen. So that's why when we see somebody doing something that we deem truly altruistic, like they are not going to get any reward for it, but it helps the group, we're so amazed by it. We're so awed by it because it is rare. And it's rare because group selection decreases the reproductive success of individuals. It doesn't make any sense. It won't help you reproduce, and it won't even help the group as much. So why would you do it? So which behavior ultimately can be linked to a selfish gene? So basically I'm asking which of these behaviors can be explained through kin selection or reciprocal altruism? Yes, I would say number 4. Number 4 is the most obvious one, whereas the number 1 through 3, those are acts that are more truly altruistic. They're pretty selfless. You're not really getting a reproductive success from that as much as you're helping your group of the human race. Alright, so now we'll talk about sexual conflict. It can result in disparities in reproductive investment by males and females. We see this as humans. Like what it takes for, I mean, you should care for your children, but technically, if we just look at it biologically, what sort of input the guy has to perform to take care of the offspring versus the females have to perform. Drastically different in humans. And it's actually drastically different in mammals in general. So there are big differences in how males and females invest in reproduction. This has effects on a lot of things. It has effects on courtship, parental investment, forming and breaking of bonds and ties, monogamy versus polygamy. So why do males usually compete for females rather than the opposite? And that's because additional matings usually lead to greater increase in reproduction and fitness for males. Because of that, selective pressure has resulted in the evolution of some differences in male and female reproductive behavior. So for males, the most effective way to maximize reproductive success often is found in gain access to mating opportunities with additional females. For females, an effective way to maximize reproductive success often is to put more effort into parenting and less effort into mating. So why do males usually compete for females rather than the opposite? Well, it has to do with how many offspring males versus females can have. Obviously, females are more limited than males. So their evolutionary evolved strategy, is to put a lot of effort and time into each offspring, whereas the males are just going to keep trying to have as many offspring as possible. But that isn't true of all species. It's very true with mammals. That's because with mammals, the female literally has to carry the fetus. So she has to invest a lot of energy into producing the offspring, and then mammals lactate, have to feed their offspring. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of constant contact, whereas the males aren't really necessary for any of that. In contrast, if we look at birds, The gestation is external, so those eggs are laid and then the baby's going to grow in the egg, and there's no lactation. So male and female investment becomes more nearly equal after fertilization in birds. Before emergence of the chick, much of the development of the fertilized eggs is external. The female lay an egg, but either the male or the female can protect and incubate the developing embryo. Further, birds do not lactate. So once hatched, the chicks must be fed, a task that can be done by both parents. So, because of this different reproductive investment in the birds compared to the mammals, in bird species, the maximum lifetime reproductive output of males and females is similar. So here's a penguin. Pretty fascinating. The female's going to lay the egg. The dude's going to put it on his feet and protect it and keep it warm while the female goes and gets the food and she comes back. The bird's going to hatch while she's getting the food on her way back, so that when she gets there, the baby bird is hatched from the dad taking care of it, and she feeds it. A different example here would be amphibians. So they have external fertilization, and that further reduces the reproductive investment of the female. She does not spend any energy as the fertilized eggs begins developing in her embryo. So males and females really just don't even invest in the case of amphibians. She can just lay the egg out there. The dude can add the sperm outside of the female frog. So they're really not invested at all. They kind of just leave the fertilized eggs there and they go do their business. Another profound consequence of internal fertilization is that males cannot be 100% certain that any offspring a female produces are his progeny. Because it is possible for a female to mate with multiple males, any of whom could be the father, male mammals and birds will always have some degree of paternal uncertainty. And that has a profound influence on reproductive behavior. All right, go ahead and answer this question. The answer is number 2. Okay, so in mammals and many other animals, there are important differences between males and females relating to reproduction. In mammals, fertilization is happening internally, lactation is female only. In species where fertilization occurs inside the female, males cannot be certain that offspring are progeny. The fact that physical differences in males and females lead to differences in reproductive investment gives rise to 2 predictions about sex-related behavior. The first is that the sex that invests more will be more discriminating. Number 2 is that the sex that invests less will compete amongst themselves for access to the higher investing sex. All right. So here's a opposite example. Usually we think females are more discriminating and the males are competing with each other. Well, in the case of bush crickets, the male is more discriminating. That's because he loses about 1/4 of his body weight contributing a massive ejaculate that the female uses for energy. So males are very choosy. They're going to give up a lot of their body weight and their nutrients. They better make sure that's the right female cricket for them. That's going to successfully raise their offspring. So if we look at their contribution during sex, that would be the equivalent of nearly 50 pounds of semen in humans. So male bush crickets reject small females that would produce relatively few offspring. So in that case, the male has more to lose, so the male is choosier. All right, go ahead and answer this. Okay, so in humans, males are most vulnerable when providing parental care because of paternity uncertainty. So they can't be guaranteed, well, we can now because of DNA testing, but in general, there's always some level of paternity uncertainty in animals. Otherwise, females are putting in all the parental care and are typically the most vulnerable. All right, different patterns of investment in reproduction makes males and females vulnerable at different stages of the process, and this has contributed to the evolution of differences in sexual behavior. The sex with greater investment in reproduction is more discriminating about mates, and the opposite gender is going to compete among themselves. Tactics for getting a mate. Competition and courtship can help males and females secure reproductive success. Female choosiness and the male competition it leads to tends to increase the likelihood that a female will select only those males that have plentiful resources or relatively high quality genes, either of which is beneficial to the female, causing her to produce more or better offspring, where better may mean increased disease resistance or physical traits that will be found attractive by future mates. So female choosiness is manifested by 4 general rules. The first one is mate only after subjecting a male to courtship rituals. In many bird species, the female requires the male to perform elaborate and time-consuming courtship dances before she will mate with him. For example, this bird featured here has a courtship dance that involves fancy dives into the water, graceful hovering, various head movements, and flamboyant twists and turns. The courtship process can go on for days, but if the male passes the time-consuming audition, he can generally be counted on to stick around to see a brood through hatching and early care. The next one is mate only with a male who controls valuable resources. So here's a yellow-bellied marmot. They prefer rock outcroppings that provide retreats for escape from predators and for hibernation. These outcroppings are controlled by dominant males. So territorial defense is a common means by which males compete for access to females. So the females want to mate with the male that has the best property. That's their resource in the case of marmots. Next, mate only with a male who contributes a large parental investment up front. Better than a believable pledge to commit resources to future offspring is an actual exchange in which a female requires a male to give her his parental investment up front in the form of resources that will help her maximize her reproductive success. In the hanging fly, for example, a female will not mate with a male unless he brings her a big piece of food called a nuptial gift, usually a dead insect. The larger the food item, the longer she will mate and the more she eats. The larger the number of eggs she will lay. Lastly, mate only with males that have valuable physical attributes. Male-male competition for the chance to mate with females can also take a more literal form, actual physical contests. Across the animal kingdom, from dung beetles to hippopotamuses, male-male contests determine the dominance rankings of males. Females then mate primarily with the highest ranked males. In a similar process, instead of choosing the best fighting or the largest male, females sometimes base their choice on some other physical attribute. That could be antler size in red deer. It could be the color of their feathers in the case of peacocks. So a lot of people think that the female peacock is the flashy, pretty one because we think females are so pretty compared to males in general. But it's actually the males that are flashy and pretty and have those beautiful feathers. The female is just brown. And now you know why. This has consequences on monogamy versus polygamy. So mating patterns have everything to do with evolution. They can vary across human and animal cultures. Polygamy and monogamy are two types of mating systems that describe the patterns of mating behaviors in a species. It is called polygamy when some individuals attract multiple mates with other individuals, while other individuals attract none. Polygamy can be contrasted with the case of monogamy, in which most individuals mate and remain with just one mate. In the case of most mammals, we often see polygamy. And that has to do with how much the females have to invest in their offspring versus the males. So the males can go around and produce as many offspring as possible with as many mates as possible. So we see polygamy often in mammals. But in birds, remember they both equally contribute, typically they equally contribute to the success of their offspring. So they usually are monogamous, over 90% of bird species. Are humans monogamous or polygamous? Well, it's kind of going to vary across cultures. So males consistently have greater variance in reproductive success than females. That's just if you take an average across cultures. So because men, it's the case of mammals in general, it's the same as the elephant seal really. Because men can have as many offspring as they want, They're going to increase their reproductive success by having as many mates as possible. Whereas women are going to have a low number of children and reproduce more monogamously. Okay, so answer this question. The answer is number 2. There's more variation in the number of offspring. Women tend to have a pretty fixed number of offspring that they usually stay in those numbers, but in some males can have upwards of, technically, there's reports of dozens and dozens of offspring, versus women will never do that. Different mating systems. Polygyny and polyandry are types of polygamy. You don't need to know those two terms, just know polygamy versus monogamy. So we also have this thing called sexual dimorphism. So it's an indicator of population's mating behavior. So the more that the mating behavior is going to be focused on polygamy, the more the mating behavior is going to be focused on male-male competition and female choosiness, we're going to see a lot of sexual dimorphism. That means like differences between the sexes in size or appearance. But birds tend to be monogamous, so the sexual dimorphisms really aren't there as much. So you can see how evolution's having effects on this mating behaviors. We have seen how male elephant seals have a winner-take-all tournament for control of the beach, and as the winner, a male has access to mating opportunities. Because the largest individual will have the most offspring, there is selection for larger and larger body size. There is no selection for larger body size among female elephant seals because females of any size can mate. Hence the dramatic size difference between the sexes. In addition to body size, coloration can also be a clue to behavior because females of some species choose the males with the brightest or flashiest colors rather than the largest males. The male-male competition sometimes results in differences in physical appearance instead of size. So that peacock example. So why is it almost impossible to distinguish males from females in most bird species? That peacock is an exception, but usually they look similar to each other. That's because they're monogamous. If men are bigger than women in a species, that's going to tell us that they favor polygamy and female choosiness. So differences in the level of competition among individuals for mating opportunities can lead to female-male differences in body size, those dimorphisms. But in monogamous species, we don't really see that as much. The last behavior we'll talk about in the context of evolution is animal communication. It's a complex behavior. An action or signal on the part of an organism that alters the behavior of another organism is defined as communication. Communication doesn't just include talking as humans. There's lots of different forms of communication shown here. You have chemical communication, shown here on the left. So pheromones are released by an individual, that's a chemical, and then detected by another individual that triggers a response. Humans give off pheromones as well. You could have acoustic communication, talking, roaring, barking. You could have visual communication. Here we have a pufferfish puffing up to convey a message like, hey, there's a threat nearby. Language is a very specific type of communication in which arbitrary symbols represent concepts, and a system of rules called grammar dictates the way the symbols can be manipulated to communicate and express ideas. It is not always easy to identify language. So honeybees have this really complex dance that they do to tell the other bees, hey, I found some resources over here, let's go get them. And they can find the exact location based on this dance, and we haven't quite figured it out. This is just showing you examples of complex communication. Something that I just briefly want to talk about is fireflies flashing. So it's actually male fireflies that flash, and they're trying to send out communication regarding mating. So how do female fireflies decide which male to respond to? The answer is that females prefer males with robust flashing patterns. So if you really concentrate, you can see there's different patterns and different lengths of time between flashes or intensity of the brightness for different fireflies. So there's different methods of communication, then they influence fitness and evolution